5 words. That's all it took to destroy my father's 30-year military legacy. And I was the one who typed them. Service record does not match. For years, he called me the part-time soldier until the VA system forced him to admit which one of us was faking our service. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I barely noticed. My entire focus was locked on the name glaring back at me from the computer screen, Kane Grantel. I'd been reviewing Veterans Benefits Administration claims all morning, the usual mix of honorable discharges and legitimate PTSD cases, when the system flagged this particular file for manual review. Standard procedure, except this wasn't just another veteran. This was my father. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, suddenly numb. The last time I'd seen Colonel Grant Kane, he'd been standing in our family's driveway, his face purple with rage as he threw my West Point acceptance letter into the trash. "The Army's gone soft if they're taking girls like you," he'd spat before slamming the door. That was 12 years ago. We hadn't spoken since. Now here he was, in my jurisdiction, needing my approval for his disability claim. I clicked open the file with deliberate calm, the way I'd approach a live mine in the field. The application showed he was claiming 80% disability for PTSD and back injuries sustained in Vietnam. Attached were the usual documents: his DD-214 discharge papers, medical evaluations, the standard VA forms filled out in that aggressive block handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. Something felt off immediately. Hey, beautiful soul. Before we dive in, show some love with a like, tap subscribe, and tell me, where in this big, beautiful world are you watching from? First red flag, the submission date. He'd filed exactly 1 week after my promotion to Senior Benefits Officer was announced in the Army Times. Coincidence didn't exist in the Kane family-only strategy. Second red flag, the listed service injuries didn't match the stories he'd built his entire identity around. According to these documents, he'd been medically evacuated after 6 months in country. Yet my entire childhood, I'd heard tales of his 2 tours of duty and years in the jungle. Third and most damning, the signature line. Under Authorizing Officer, the system automatically populated my name and rank, Captain Sierra Kane, U.S. Army. He would have seen that when he submitted. He knew exactly who'd be reviewing his case. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. All those years of him dismissing my service, mocking my desk job, insisting real soldiers didn't need paperwork. Now here he was, begging for my signature on his. The office around me faded into white noise. The hum of computers, the murmur of colleagues discussing cases, even the ticking clock above the door, all disappeared as I stared at that screen. This wasn't just another claim. This was a reckoning 12 years in the making. I reached for my coffee out of habit, the ceramic cold against my palm. Outside the window, an American flag snapped in the winter wind. Somewhere across town, my father was probably sitting in his leather armchair, the walls around him lined with shadow boxes of medals he may or may not have earned, waiting for the system to bow to his legacy. He didn't know yet. The system had changed. And this time, his fate rested in the hands of the daughter he'd written off. I minimized the file and stood abruptly, needing air. The hallway was empty except for the portrait of General Powell watching from the far wall. My breathing steadied as I walked past framed photos of VA leadership, many of them women now, many of them combat veterans like me. When I returned to my desk, the screen still glowed with his application. My fingers found the keyboard with new certainty. I clicked Request Full Service Record and typed the comment box. Discrepancies noted between claimed service dates and historical deployment records. Require complete personnel file for verification. Then I leaned back and waited for the truth to come marching home. The memory hit me like a poorly secured rucksack to the chest as I sat in the VA office. 5 years earlier, at Drew's promotion ceremony to captain, the entire Kane family had gathered at the officers' club. I'd just returned from my first deployment, 6 months analyzing IED patterns in Afghanistan that saved an entire platoon, but no one asked about it. I stood stiffly in my dress blues near the buffet table, the only woman in our family's military lineage. Dad held court at the center of the room, his booming voice carrying over the clink of glasses. "That's my boy," he announced, clapping Drew on the shoulder. Third-generation combat pilot. The way God intended a soldier to serve. The room erupted in applause. My brother flushed with pride while Dad's Marine buddies nodded approvingly. Then his gaze slid to me, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. "And Sierra's here too," he added, like an afterthought. "Doing whatever it is she does with computers." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not cruel laughter, the uncomfortable kind people make when they don't know what else to do. My mother busied herself with the cake knife. Drew wouldn't meet my eyes. I remember the exact shade of burgundy in the carpet as I walked to the bathroom, counting my steps to keep steady. A group of lieutenants parted to let me pass, their expressions caught between pity and discomfort. That was the worst part, not the dismissal itself, but how everyone around us accepted it as normal. In the mirror, my reflection stared back in full dress uniform, hair regulation tight, medals perfectly aligned. The army had deemed me worthy of leading soldiers. My own father couldn't even acknowledge my presence without turning it into a joke. When I returned, the conversation had moved on to Drew's upcoming fighter jet training. Someone had taken my seat at the family table. I spent the rest of the evening by the punch bowl, watching Dad hold up Drew's new gold bars to the light like they were precious gems while mine, identical in every way, remained unseen in my pocket. Now, years later in the VA office, my fingers tightened around the mouse. That same familiar acid rose in my throat as I clicked through Dad's benefit claim. The dates didn't add up. The stories didn't match. The man who'd built his entire identity on being a battle-hardened warrior was suddenly claiming disabilities from a tour he'd barely completed. Outside my window, a new batch of veterans arrived for their appointments, some walking with canes, others with the 1,000-yard stare I recognized from my own soldiers. These were the people this system existed to protect. Not men who spent decades bragging about service they never finished, only to come begging when consequences finally caught up. I opened a new case file and began typing with deliberate precision. Every discrepancy would be documented. Every exaggeration would be fact-checked. If Grant Kane wanted benefits from the system his daughter represented, he'd get exactly what he deserved, the unvarnished truth. The keyboard clacked louder than usual in the quiet office. My colleagues probably thought I was just another caseworker processing another claim. They didn't know I was dismantling a family myth 20 years in the making, one keystroke at a time. Somewhere across town, my father was probably telling someone another war story. Soon enough, he'd learn the same lesson every soldier eventually does: paperwork always wins. The day I received my West Point acceptance letter, I had raced home from school with the envelope clutched in my hands, my heart pounding against my ribs. 17 years old and already knowing this was my only way out, my only chance to prove I belonged in the Kane family legacy. I found my father in his study, polishing his Marine Corps dress shoes like they were sacred relics. "Dad," I had said, breathless from running, holding out the thick envelope with its distinctive crest. I got in. He took the letter without looking up, his hands still working the brush over the leather. I watched his face as he read it, searching for the pride I'd seen when Drew made varsity football. Instead, his jaw tightened. He set the letter on his desk and reached for the shoe polish again. "They're taking women now to fill quotas," he said, the words casual, like he was commenting on the weather. "Don't expect special treatment just because of what's between your legs." The polished rag made a soft shushing sound as he buffed the toe of his shoe. I stood frozen, the acceptance letter suddenly heavy in my hand. Down the hall, I could hear Drew laughing with his friends in the kitchen. The smell of my mother's meatloaf drifted through the house. Normal family sounds, normal family smells, while my world cracked open. That night at dinner, Dad held up Drew's latest football trophy. "Now this," he announced to the table, "is an accomplishment." The trophy gleamed under the dining room light, its golden figure forever frozen in mid-throw. My West Point letter remained unmentioned, tucked under my math textbook upstairs. 2 weeks later, when Dad took Drew to the gun range to celebrate his mediocre SAT scores, I sat alone in my room with a borrowed copy of Beast Barracks' Survival Guide. The sound of their truck pulling out of the driveway, the crunch of gravel, the rumble of the engine echoed through my empty house. I ran my finger over the West Point crest on the letter and made my first military decision. I would become twice the soldier Drew could ever be. Now, years later in the VA office, I pulled up Dad's service records with the same single-minded focus I'd used to survive cadet basic training. The truth appeared line by line on my screen: his early discharge, the disciplinary notations, the missing combat deployments he'd bragged about for decades. Each revelation landed like a well-placed round, precise, devastating, undeniable. The office chair creaked as I leaned back. Outside, a group of veterans smoked by the bike racks, their laughter floating through the window. I wondered if Dad had ever sat at a VA like this one, spinning war stories to impress strangers. I wondered how many of those stories would hold up under the cold light of official documentation. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. With a few keystrokes, I could request his full personnel file, the unvarnished truth behind the family legend. The mouse cursor blinked, waiting. Somewhere in the building, a printer hummed to life. Somewhere in the city, my father was probably telling someone about his imaginary heroics. And somewhere in my chest, that 17-year-old girl still stood holding her acceptance letter, waiting for approval that would never come. I clicked Request Full Records. The system processed the command with a cheerful ping. Justice, I had learned, often came quietly. Not through shouting matches or dramatic confrontations, but through paperwork filed in triplicate, through systems that didn't care about family names or tall tales. The truth was coming, and this time, Colonel Grant Kane wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it. The email notification arrived at 3:17 a.m., waking me from the shallow sleep of someone trained to respond to midnight alerts. The VA Records Department had processed my request. Grant Kane's complete military file, every commendation, every disciplinary action, every truth he'd spent 40 years rewriting, now waited in my inbox. I sat up in bed, the blue light of my laptop cutting through the dark apartment. The first document was his enlistment record. There it was in stark courier font: Kane, Grant L. Entered active duty, June 12, 1972. Exactly as he'd always claimed. But the next line made my breath catch. Early discharge, November 18, 1972. Reason: disciplinary action, Article 15. 5 months. Not 2 tours. Not years of jungle warfare. 5 months before the Marines kicked him out. I scrolled further, each click stripping away another layer of his mythology. His medical records showed no combat injuries, just a sprained wrist from what appeared to be a bar fight in Okinawa. The after-action reports told the real story: an unauthorized absence, a stolen jeep, a drunken brawl with MPs. Not a single firefight. Not one day in actual Vietnam. The screen blurred. All those childhood lectures about honor and sacrifice. The way he'd mocked my Army physical therapy after I tore my ACL in airborne training. The Christmas he'd gotten drunk and told my cousins I'd never know real service. Every word had been a lie. My fingers moved on their own, pulling up his VA claims history. The first request dated back to 1985, denied for insufficient evidence. He'd tried again in 1992, 2001, 2007. Always denied. Always for the same reason: no proof of combat service. Then came the most damning document, a 1998 internal memo from the VA Fraud Division. Subject: repeated false claims by Grant Kane, SSN redacted. The investigators' notes were clinical. Subject continues to allege Purple Heart and Bronze Star with no DD-214 verification. Recommend permanent flag on file. I sat back, the mattress springs creaking. All those framed medals in his study. The war stories he'd told at every family gathering. The way he'd touch his non-existent shrapnel scars when recounting Hughes City. Pure theater. Outside, a garbage truck groaned down the alley. The first gray light of dawn crept through my blinds. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt nothing but a cold, surgical clarity, the same focus I used when dismantling roadside bombs. I opened a new case file. The words came easily now. Fraud investigation required. Discrepancies between claimed service, Vietnam combat veteran, and actual record, 5-month stateside deployment with disciplinary discharge. The system pinged when I attached the evidence, his Article 15 paperwork, the fraud memo, the medical records showing no combat injuries. Each document landed like a verdict. Somewhere across town, my father was probably sleeping under the same roof as his stolen Valor shadow boxes. Tomorrow, he'd wake to a certified letter from the VA. Not from his little girl. From Captain Kane, Senior Benefits Officer. I hit send as the sun rose. Let the system do what it did best, separate truth from fiction. After 30 years of his stories, the paperwork would finally tell the real one. The notification from the VA case management system appeared exactly 48 hours after I submitted my findings, a terse update stating Grant Kane's benefits claim had been flagged for fraud investigation. No fanfare. No dramatic confrontation. Just a bureaucratic process grinding forward with impersonal efficiency. I closed the alert without responding, the same way I'd ignore an incoming round that had already missed its target. My phone lit up with the first call within the hour. I let it ring through while stirring cream into my coffee, watching the liquid swirl into a temporary cyclone before settling into stillness. The voicemail notification popped up, but I didn't listen. There were only so many ways a man like Grant Kane could say, "How dare you," before devolving into threats. The real test came at 1900 hours when my mother called. I answered on the fourth ring, holding the phone slightly away from my ear as predicted. Sierra Marie Kane. She began in the tight-lipped tone I recognized from childhood scoldings. Your father is currently under investigation for falsifying military service records. I finished for her, my voice steady. I'm aware. The silence on the line stretched 3 full seconds. When she spoke again, the anger had drained into something closer to pleading. He's your father. However you feel, this isn't the way honorable soldiers behave. I supplied. I agree. I hung up mid-sputter, then powered off my phone entirely. The tactical withdrawal wasn't about avoidance, it was about controlling the engagement. Let them rage against the VA's impersonal bureaucracy. Let them exhaust themselves trying to make this personal when the system, by design, couldn't care less about family drama. At work the next morning, I processed claims with mechanical precision. A decorated Ranger's PTSD therapy approval. A Navy corpsman's disability rating increase. Each file received my full attention, each signature inked with the same deliberate care. My father's case never left my peripheral awareness, a silent countdown to impact, but it wouldn't disrupt my duties. Sergeant Major Alvarez stopped by my desk during lunch, dropping a file folder with more force than necessary. Heard your old man's been raising hell at the regional office, she said, not bothering to lower her voice. Demanded to speak to the idiot who flagged his claim. I didn't look up from the form I was completing. Let me guess, they told him fraud investigations are handled through official channels? Gave him the 1-800 number for the Inspector General's office. Alvarez smirked, tapping the folder she'd brought. Thought you'd appreciate seeing this before it goes upstairs. Inside lay a carbon copy of my father's frantic appeal letter, 3 pages of bluster about clerical errors and bureaucratic incompetence, conspicuously avoiding any specific denial of the Article 15 discharge. The attached VA response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic deadpan. All determinations are based on verifiable service records per 38 CFR 3.204. No further action will be taken without new, credible evidence. I handed it back with a nod. No victory lap. No visible reaction. The documents spoke for themselves. That evening, I walked past the VA's memorial wall where sunlight streamed through bullet hole-shaped perforations in the steel. Names of the fallen shimmered on the floor in temporary constellations. Somewhere beyond these walls, my father was likely rehearsing another version of events where he was the wronged hero. Let him talk. The system had already rendered its verdict. I adjusted my uniform cap and stepped into the afternoon light. The war for truth wasn't fought with shouting matches or tearful reunions. It was won through patient accumulation of facts, through letting institutional processes unfold at their own inexorable pace. My phone remained off as I drove home. The silence wasn't avoidance, it was the calm at the center of the storm, the eye where clarity lived. Let the winds rage elsewhere. I had paperwork to file. The manila envelope arrived via interoffice mail, its surface marked with the red confidential stamp I'd come to recognize like a battlefield hazard marker. Inside lay the full fruits of my records request, every page the military bureaucracy had ever generated about Colonel Grant Kane, each one a silent indictment. I spread them across my desk with the same methodical care I'd used to map an enemy's position before an operation. Topmost was his original enlistment contract, signed with the same flourish I'd seen on school permission slips. The dates confirmed what I already knew: 5 months of service, not the 2 tours he'd claimed. But beneath it lay something more damning, a disciplinary report detailing his drunken theft of a military vehicle. The attached photo showed a younger version of my father, bleary-eyed in a holding cell, his dress uniform disheveled. The date stamp placed the incident 3 weeks before his discharge. I photographed each page with my secure work phone, the camera flash reflecting off the decades-old paper. These weren't just documents, they were evidence in the case I'd been building my entire life. The case that proved I was the real soldier in the Kane family. Next came his medical records. No shrapnel wounds. No combat injuries. Just a psych evaluation noting antisocial tendencies and pathological dishonesty. The evaluating officer had scribbled in the margin. Recommend immediate separation. Liabilities outweigh any potential value to Corps. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned to his post-discharge VA claims history. Page after page of rejected applications, each denial stamped with increasingly stern warnings about fraudulent claims. The 1998 fraud investigation memo I'd already seen was just the tip of the iceberg. He'd been trying and failing to scam the system for 30 years. The final document made my breath catch. A 2010 internal memo from the VA Benefits Office warning staff about a persistent claimant falsely alleging combat service in Vietnam. The caseworker had noted, subject becomes verbally abusive when challenged. Claims daughter is some desk jockey who wouldn't understand real service. I sat back, the office chair creaking under my weight. Outside my window, the American flag snapped in the afternoon breeze. Somewhere beyond these walls, my father was still spinning his war stories, still playing the decorated veteran. But here in this room, the truth lay exposed. Page after page of official records proving he'd built his entire identity on lies. I methodically scanned each document into the case file, attaching them to his pending claim with clinical precision. The system would do the rest. Fraud investigations moved slowly but inexorably, like glaciers carving valleys through stone. As I worked, Sergeant Major Alvarez appeared in my doorway, her arms crossed. "He's here," she said quietly, making a scene at the front desk, demanding to see whoever's handling his case. I didn't look up from the scanner. "Tell him all fraud investigations are handled through official channels." Alvarez smirked. "Already did. He claims there's been a mistake. Then he should file a formal appeal." I fed another page into the machine. With evidence. The hum of the scanner filled the silence between us. Alvarez watched as I worked, the documents piling up in the processed tray. "You know they'll probably just give him a slap on the wrist," she finally said. "Guys like him always skate." I met her gaze for the first time. "Maybe, but his file will be flagged forever. Every time he tries this, they'll see the pattern." I tapped the growing stack of papers. The truth adds up. Outside my office, raised voices echoed down the hall. I recognized my father's bluster, the same tone he'd used when lecturing me about military bearing. But beneath the anger, I heard something new, the faintest thread of panic. The scanner beeped its completion. I closed the case file with a final keystroke. The system pinged its acceptance, locking the documents into the official record where no amount of shouting could remove them. Let him rage at receptionists. Let him threaten lawsuits. The paperwork didn't care about his ego. The truth didn't bend for bullies. I slid the originals back into their envelope, the weight of them satisfying in my hands. These weren't just records. They were receipts. And I'd been collecting them my entire life. The commotion at the VA front desk had reached a crescendo when I heard a new voice cut through the chaos, a gravelly baritone that carried the unmistakable authority of a senior NCO. "That's enough, Marine." The words weren't shouted, but they landed like a mortar round. The entire office fell silent. I peered through my slightly ajar door to see Sergeant Major Terrence Bull Mendez, a barrel-chested Vietnam veteran who ran the VA's outreach program, standing between my father and the terrified receptionist. At 6'4" with a silver star and 2 Purple Hearts, Mendez was one of the few people who could physically intimidate Grant Kane. "You're making a scene in front of people who actually earn their benefits," Mendez said, his voice low but carrying. "Walk away now, or I'll have security escort you out. Your choice." My father's face flushed that familiar shade of puce I remembered from childhood tantrums. "Do you know who I am?" Mendez didn't blink. "Yeah. You're the guy who got chaptered out after 5 months for stealing a Jeep while the real Marines were getting shot at in Kisan." He leaned in slightly. "And right now, you're harassing my staff." I watched from my office as the blood drained from my father's face. Mendez knew. Of course he knew. The veteran community in this town was tighter than a drumhead, and Mendez had been processing claims since the 1980s. He'd probably seen my father's previous attempts to game the system. My father left without another word, the glass doors swinging shut behind him with a soft hiss. Mendez turned toward my office as if he'd known I was watching all along. "Captain Kane," he called. A word. His office smelled of coffee and gun oil, the walls lined with shadow boxes and fading photos of young Marines in Vietnam. Mendez dropped into his chair with a grunt and pushed a file folder across the desk. "Thought you should see this." Inside were records I hadn't requested. My father's original 1972 enlistment papers. But these weren't the sanitized version from his personnel file. These were the recruiter's notes, including the handwritten observation: "Candidate shows narcissistic tendencies. Claims family military legacy, but cannot name any relatives who served. Recommend close supervision." Mendez sipped his coffee while I processed this new layer of deception. "Your old man's been telling war stories longer than some of these kids have been alive," he said finally. "But you." He nodded at my uniform. "You've got the bearing of someone who actually served." The compliment should have warmed me, but all I felt was a hollow ache. "Why show me this now?" "Because somebody should have told you years ago." Mendez tapped the file. "And because that fraud investigation you triggered? It's about to get interesting." He pulled another document from his drawer, a memo from the VA's Inspector General marked referral. "United States versus Kane, Grant L. Stolen Valor Act violations." I stared at the paper. My administrative review had apparently uncovered enough discrepancies to warrant criminal investigation. The system, once set in motion, was grinding forward with terrifying efficiency. Mendez studied my reaction. "You didn't know?" "No." The word came out softer than I intended. "Good." He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "Means you did it by the book." A faint smile touched his lips. "Your first sergeant ever tell you about the paperwork ambush?" I shook my head. "Vietnam, we'd catch officers lying about their combat time," he said. "So we'd wait until they put in for some big promotion or award, then flood the system with their real records." His smile widened. "Bureaucratic claymore mine." The metaphor landed with perfect clarity. My entire career, I'd thought myself at war with my father. But the real battle had been between his ego and an implacable system that valued truth over bluster. And now, thanks to men like Mendez, men who'd actually fought the wars my father pretended to, that system was turning its full attention on Grant Kane. Mendez closed the file. "You did your job, Captain. Nothing more, nothing less." He stood, signaling the conversation was over. "Oh, and Kane." I paused at the door. "Your airborne tab's crooked." I automatically straightened it, the gesture sparking a memory of my father sneering when I'd earned that tab. "Any idiot can fall out of a plane." Mendez nodded approval. "Better. Now get back to work. Those disability claims won't process themselves." As I walked back to my office, the weight of what I'd set in motion settled over me. This wasn't just about my father anymore. It was about every stolen valor pretender who'd ever cheapened real service. And for the first time, I understood I wasn't fighting alone. The system had allies. And they'd been waiting for this moment a long time. The certified letter from the VA arrived on a Tuesday morning, its stiff envelope protruding from my mailbox like a challenge. I turned it over in my hands, tracing the embossed Department of Veterans Affairs seal with my thumb. This wasn't just correspondence, it was the culmination of 30 years of lies finally meeting bureaucratic truth. Inside, on official letterhead, was the decision I'd set in motion weeks earlier. Dear Mr. Kane, after thorough review of your service records, enclosed, we have determined your claim for service-connected disability benefits cannot be approved. Our investigation found no evidence of combat service in Vietnam, nor documentation for the injuries you claimed. Furthermore, your file has been flagged for potential violation of 18 U.S. Code Section 704, the Stolen Valor Act. You have 30 days to appeal this decision with new evidence. The attached documents were the same ones I'd compiled. His discharge papers, the disciplinary reports, the fraud investigator's notes. But seeing them here, in this formal condemnation, made my breath catch. This wasn't just my truth anymore. It belonged to the United States government now. My phone rang before I could process the full weight of the letter. My mother's number flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, already knowing the script, the tears, the accusations, the pleas to think of the family. 3 minutes later, my brother called. Then my uncle. Then my father's personal cell. I silenced my phone and placed it face down on the kitchen counter. The confrontation wasn't happening on their terms. Not this time. Instead, I dressed carefully in my Class B uniform, the one with my name tape and captain's bars prominently displayed. I pinned my awards in perfect alignment, ensuring my airborne tab sat straight. Then I drove to the one place I knew my father would be at 1,100 hours on a weekday. VFW Post 735, where he held court at the bar every Tuesday, regaling whoever would listen with his war stories. The smell of stale beer and fried food hit me as I pushed through the doors. A dozen retirees turned at the intrusion, their conversations stuttering to a halt when they saw my uniform. At the far end of the bar, my father sat perched on his usual stool, a half-finished bourbon in front of him. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. Then he stood, his face darkening. "What the hell are you doing here?" I didn't raise my voice. The quiet carried better in the hushed room. "I thought you should hear it from me first." I held up the VA letter. "Your claim was denied. Permanently." His hand twitched toward the envelope, but I pulled it back. "They found discrepancies in your service record. Big ones." The bartender edged away. The other patrons had gone preternaturally still, sensing the tectonic shift happening before them. My father's face cycled through expressions, anger, confusion, then the dawning horror of realization. "You," he breathed. I didn't nod, didn't confirm. Just let the silence stretch until it became its own admission. His fist came down on the bar, rattling glasses. "You ungrateful little." "Careful," I interrupted, still calm. "There's more." I tapped the letter. "The Stolen Valor Act carries up to a year in prison. And the VA's already forwarded your case to the U.S. Attorney." The color drained from his face. Around us, men he'd lied to for decades exchanged glances. Someone muttered, "Jesus Christ." I didn't smile, didn't gloat, just let the truth settle over the room like dust after an explosion. Then I turned to leave. He caught my arm at the door, his grip painfully tight. "You'll regret this," he hissed. I looked down at his hand until he released me. "No," I said quietly. "I won't." Outside, the sunlight was blinding. I walked to my car without looking back, the letter still clutched in my hand. The confrontation hadn't been about shouting matches or dramatic revelations. It had been about standing in a room full of witnesses and letting the system speak for itself. By now, the regulars at the VFW would be pulling out their phones, calling buddies at other posts, spreading the news through the veteran grapevine. Within hours, everyone who'd ever listened to Grant Kane's war stories would know the truth. I started the engine and drove away, watching the VFW recede in my rearview mirror. The real damage wasn't the legal jeopardy or even the lost benefits. It was the one thing my father couldn't survive, his reputation crumbling in the eyes of the only audience that ever mattered to him. The system had spoken. The records didn't lie. And for the first time in my life, I hadn't needed to raise my voice to be heard. The email from the VA Office of Inspector General arrived at 0630 on a Thursday morning, its subject line blandly ominous: Case referral update, Kane, G. I opened it standing in my kitchen, the glow of my laptop cutting through the pre-dawn dark. The message contained 3 terse sentences confirming what I'd set in motion weeks earlier. My father's case had been formally referred to the Justice Department for potential prosecution under the Stolen Valor Act. I closed the laptop with a quiet click. Outside my window, the first hints of sunrise painted the Arlington skyline in pale gold. Somewhere across the river, my father was likely still asleep, unaware that the system he'd spent a lifetime gaming had finally turned its full attention on him. At work that morning, the VA offices hummed with its usual bureaucratic energy, but I noticed the subtle shifts, the way clerks nodded to me with new respect as I passed. How Sergeant Major Mendez gave me an almost imperceptible thumbs up from his workstation. News traveled fast in government buildings, especially when it involved someone attempting to defraud the very system we served. My inbox had a new message from the Undersecretary for Benefits, requesting my presence at a working group on fraud prevention. The attachment listed me as subject matter expert, case study number 4472, my father's file number. The institutional machinery was absorbing my personal vendetta and repurposing it as policy. At lunch, Alvarez slid into the chair across from me in the cafeteria. "Heard your old man's been calling every JAG officer he knows," she said around a bite of sandwich. "Turns out stolen valor cases don't get you top-tier defense." I stirred my coffee, watching the cream swirl. What did they tell him? What they always tell guys like him: take the plea deal before it gets worse. She wiped her hands on a napkin. "Funny thing though, the prosecutor's office called me this morning. Wanted to know if you'd testify if this goes to trial." The plastic stir stick snapped between my fingers. I hadn't considered that possibility. Standing in a federal courtroom under oath, detailing my father's lies to a jury. The image should have brought satisfaction. Instead, it settled like a stone in my gut. Alvarez studied my face. "You wouldn't be the first VA officer to put family in jail. Won't be the last." I tossed the broken stir stick in the trash. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But the system had its own momentum now. That afternoon, as I processed a Purple Heart recipient's claim, my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. Dad got the plea offer. 6 months probation, $10,000 fine, public apology. He's losing it. I didn't respond. The decision wasn't mine to make, not anymore. The case belonged to the United States now, just like my service belonged to something larger than family drama. Walking to my car that evening, I passed the VA's memorial wall again. The names of the fallen glowed under the floodlights. My father had spent decades pretending his name belonged alongside theirs. Now the truth would be a matter of public record. As I drove home, a news alert popped up on my phone. A local reporter had filed a FOIA request on high-profile stolen valor cases. My father's name appeared third on the list. The institutional shift was complete. What began as a daughter's quiet reckoning had become a matter of public accountability. The system worked how it always did, slowly, methodically, and with perfect indifference to personal consequences. I turned onto my street, the headlights sweeping across my apartment building. Somewhere in the city, my father was likely raging against the machine he'd spent a lifetime pretending to serve. But the machine didn't care about his anger. It only cared about the truth. The summons arrived on heavy cardstock embossed with the Department of Justice seal. I turned it over in my hands, running my thumb along the crisp edge where it had been slit open by a letter knife. The words "United States versus Granell, Kane" stood out in bold type, followed by my name as witness for the prosecution. I set the document on my kitchen counter beside my morning coffee, watching the steam rise in thin curls as I absorbed the reality. My father would be standing before a federal judge because of evidence I had compiled. The daughter he dismissed as a paper pusher now held the power to determine whether he faced prison time. At work, the VA had reassigned me to oversee the newly created Fraud Prevention Unit, a quiet promotion that came with a security clearance upgrade and a corner office. My first task was drafting protocols for identifying stolen valor cases, protocols based on the very discrepancies I'd spotted in my father's records. The irony wasn't lost on the undersecretary when he handed me the assignment. Sometimes the best experts come from unexpected places, he'd said with a knowing look. My phone buzzed with a text from my brother. Dad took the plea deal. Judge is making him return all his VA payments with interest. A follow-up message appeared. He has to stand in front of the VFW next week and admit he lied. I sipped my coffee, watching sunlight creep across the summons. The legal consequences were severe enough. The fines would cripple him financially. The probation would follow him for years. But the true punishment was the public humiliation. Grant Kane, who'd built his identity on military honor, would have to confess his fraud to the very men he'd deceived for decades. A knock at my office door interrupted my thoughts. Sergeant Major Mendez entered holding a thick file folder. "Thought you should see this before it goes to the judge," he said, dropping it on my desk. Inside were copies of every fraudulent claim my father had filed over 30 years, dozens of pages documenting his systematic lies. Mendez pointed to a highlighted section. "Notice the pattern? Every time you hit a career milestone, West Point graduation, your commission, that Bronze Star, he filed another claim." His finger tapped the dates. Like clockwork. I stared at the documents, understanding dawning. My achievements had threatened him so profoundly that he doubled down on his own false heroism each time. The realization should have angered me. Instead, I felt something closer to pity. The power reversal was now complete. The man who'd once mocked my service now faced consequences because of my position within the system he'd tried to cheat. The daughter he'd called a part-time soldier would help shape policies preventing fraud against real veterans. That evening, I drove to the Vietnam Memorial. The black granite wall stretched before me, countless names shimmering under the lights. Somewhere in this sea of sacrifice, there were soldiers who died without recognition while men like my father stole valor they hadn't earned. I placed my hand against the cool stone, feeling the engraved letters beneath my fingertips. This was the legacy that mattered, not family drama, not personal vendettas, but honoring those who'd actually served. My phone buzzed again. Another text from my brother. "Dad's lawyer says the judge might go easier if you write a character letter." I slid the phone back into my pocket unanswered. The system would decide my father's fate based on facts, not familial loyalty. That was the whole point. As I walked back to my car, a group of veterans passed me, their unit patches visible under jacket collars. One nodded respectfully at my uniform. "Thank you for your service, Captain." The words landed differently now. Not as empty platitudes, but as earned recognition. My father's opinion had ceased to matter the moment I stopped needing his approval. Power, I realized, wasn't about vengeance. It was about standing firmly in your own truth while letting systems larger than family or ego deliver justice. The summons waited on my desk when I returned to work the next morning. I filed it carefully in my active cases folder, not as a daughter settling a score, but as an officer fulfilling her duty. Let the record show the truth. That was victory enough. The morning of my father's sentencing hearing dawned clear and cold. I dressed carefully in my service blues, ensuring every ribbon was perfectly aligned, every insignia polished to a high shine. The mirror reflected a soldier, not the pretend warrior my father had pretended to be, but an officer who had earned her place through sweat and sacrifice. The federal courthouse loomed before me, its marble steps worn smooth by decades of petitioners seeking justice. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and anxiety. I took my seat in the back row, unnoticed among the spectators. My father sat at the defendant's table, shoulders hunched in a suit that suddenly looked too large for him. The proud Marine persona had evaporated, leaving behind a shrunken old man awaiting judgment. When the judge entered, the room rose as one. The proceedings moved with clinical efficiency, the prosecutor outlining the charges, the defense attorney pleading for leniency. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "we'd like to enter into Evidence Exhibit 17, Captain Kane's service record for comparison." A murmur ran through the courtroom as the clerk handed up a file. My file. The judge adjusted his glasses, flipping through pages that detailed my 2 combat deployments, my Purple Heart, my Bronze Star. The same achievements my father had mocked for years now being held up as the standard against which his fraud would be measured. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, as the judge compared the 2 records side by side. The truth required no commentary. When it came time for sentencing, the judge didn't rant or moralize. He simply stated facts. "Mr. Kane, you stole honor from those who earned it. The court sentences you to 6 months home confinement, 3 years probation, and full restitution of all fraudulent benefits received. Then, almost as an afterthought, you will also complete 500 hours of community service at the VA hospital." The gavel fell. My father's head dropped. And just like that, 30 years of stolen valor ended with a bureaucrat's signature. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around the prosecutor. I slipped out a side exit, the winter sun bright on my face. My phone buzzed, a message from the undersecretary. "Your fraud prevention protocols go live next week." Well done. I walked past the courthouse, past the VA offices, all the way to the Vietnam Memorial. The black granite wall stretched before me, endless names shimmering in the midday light. I traced one at random: PFC James R. Holloway, 19 years old when he died in a jungle my father had never seen. From my briefcase, I removed my father's VFW pin, the one he'd worn every Veterans Day while spinning his lies. I placed it at the base of the wall, beside a faded photograph left by some grieving family. No dramatic speech. No tears. Just a quiet acknowledgement that some legacies couldn't be stolen, only earned. My dress shoes clicked against the pavement as I walked away. Behind me, the memorial stood silent and enduring, its truth carved in stone. Ahead lay my office, my duties, my real service. The past was settled. The future was mine to shape. The invitation arrived on thick cardstock, embossed with the presidential seal. The White House requested my presence at a ceremony honoring modern military innovators. My photograph would appear in the program alongside a caption listing my accomplishments, the fraud prevention protocols I'd developed, the cases I'd prosecuted, the systemic reforms I'd implemented. There was no mention of my father, no reference to the personal history that had set me on this path. The omission felt like its own form of victory. I accepted the invitation without hesitation, then immediately filed it away in my pending folder between a budget report and a meeting agenda. There were no triumphant phone calls to family, no social media posts preemptively sharing the news. The work had always been about more than proving myself to one man, a truth that became clearer with each passing day. My father completed his community service at the VA hospital in near silence, pushing wheelchair-bound veterans to their appointments while avoiding eye contact with staff. I made no effort to visit him there. The weekly reports crossed my desk detailing his progress. The system required his compliance, not my supervision. When the White House ceremony arrived, I stood at attention beside Medal of Honor recipients and groundbreaking researchers as the president spoke about integrity in modern military service. The cameras flashed, capturing images that would appear in tomorrow's papers. Somewhere, my father might see them, might finally understand the distance between his fabricated heroics and genuine accomplishment. Or perhaps he would look away, clinging to his tarnished myths. It no longer mattered to me either way. After the event, a young lieutenant approached me near the punch bowl, her dress uniform as crisp as her salute. "Captain Kane," she said, "I just wanted to say, your fraud detection model saved my grandfather's benefits from being cut." "Thank you." She handed me a small card before disappearing into the crowd. Inside, in careful handwriting, was a message from her grandfather, a Vietnam vet who'd apparently followed my case in the news. "The Corps needs more like you," it read. I tucked the card into my pocket beside my security badge, the 2 items resting side by side. One represented institutional validation, the other human gratitude. Together, they formed a completeness no familial approval could ever match. My phone buzzed as I rode back to my apartment. My brother had sent a photo of our father watching the evening news, his face unreadable as my White House appearance flashed across the screen. I didn't respond. The image required no commentary, just as my silence needed no explanation. Revenge would have meant gloating. Victory meant moving forward. That night, I updated my professional portfolio with the day's honors, then prepared for tomorrow's staff meeting. The work continued, not as retaliation, but as vocation. My father's opinion had ceased to matter the moment I realized my worth wasn't his to define. Before bed, I placed the lieutenant's thank you card on my bookshelf beside my military awards. The gesture felt right. Not as a display of pride, but as a reminder that service, when performed honestly, rippled outward in ways both seen and unseen. The next morning dawned like any other, alarm clock buzzing, coffee brewing, uniform waiting. I dressed with the same care I always did, ensuring each ribbon sat straight, each insignia shone. The reflection in my mirror showed a soldier at peace, her battles fought not for personal vindication, but for something larger. I locked my apartment door behind me, the click of the latch final and unremarkable. Somewhere in the city, my father was likely beginning another day of his court-ordered routine. Our paths might never cross again, and that was fine. The system had spoken. The record stood. And I had work to do. The package arrived on a rainy April morning, the kind of damp, gray day that made my old knee injury ache. I recognized my mother's handwriting on the label before I even picked it up from my doorstep, the looping cursive she'd used on permission slips and birthday cards throughout my childhood. The box was lighter than I expected, giving no hint of its contents as I carried it inside. I set it on my kitchen table and made coffee first, the ritual giving me time to consider what might await inside. It had been 6 months since my father's sentencing, since the White House ceremony. Our only communication had been through lawyers and court-mandated paperwork. The package felt like the first crack in that careful silence. When I finally opened it, the scent of gun oil and old leather wafted out. Nestled in tissue paper lay my father's service pistol, the Colt 1911 he'd always claimed was issued to him in Vietnam, the one he'd cleaned every Sunday afternoon while lecturing us about military discipline. Except now I knew the truth. The serial number on the frame dated its manufacture to 1978, 6 years after his discharge. Another prop in his elaborate fiction. Beneath the pistol lay a single sheet of paper. Not a letter, not an apology, just a photocopy of his original DD-214 discharge form with the fraudulent claims redacted, leaving only the bare facts. 5 months of service, disciplinary termination, no decorations awarded. At the bottom, in his shaky handwriting, he'd scrawled one word: proof. I lifted the pistol from its case, the cold weight familiar in my hands. How many times had I watched him field strip this weapon, his fingers moving with performative precision as he told his made-up war stories. Now here it was, stripped of its mythology, just another civilian firearm with a falsified history. The VA's evidence locker would have been the proper place for it, another exhibit in his fraud case. Instead, I drove to the nearest Army base and surrendered it at the Gate Armory. The sergeant on duty logged it into the system without comment, just another weapon turned in through proper channels. "Need a receipt, ma'am?" he asked as I turned to leave. I shook my head. "Just make sure it's accounted for." The rain had stopped when I emerged, weak sunlight breaking through the clouds. Somewhere beyond these walls, my father was likely waiting for a response, perhaps expecting some dramatic gesture. But I'd learned the most powerful messages required no theatrics, just quiet, irreversible actions. That evening, I framed his redacted DD-214 and hung it in my office beside my own service records. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that truth needed no embellishment to matter. The side-by-side documents told their own story, his brief, dishonorable stint versus my decade of earned service. No commentary necessary. My phone buzzed around midnight. A text from my brother. "Dad's asking about the gun." I left it unanswered. Let him wonder. Let him sit with the knowledge that his most prized possession now resided in an evidence locker, its fate entirely out of his hands. The symbolism was cleaner than any confrontation, his fabricated legacy literally disarmed and secured by the very system he'd tried to cheat. The next morning brought another package, this time from the base armory. Inside was a standard Form 603, the official record of the pistol's disposal. Someone had stamped "destroyed" across the bottom in bold red letters. I filed it with my father's other paperwork, the final page in his fraudulent narrative. At work that day, Sergeant Major Mendez stopped by my office with 2 coffees. He glanced at the framed DD 214 on my wall and nodded approvingly. Clean way to handle it. We drank in comfortable silence, watching through the window as a new group of veterans arrived for their appointments, some walking with canes, others bearing the invisible wounds of service. These were the people my reforms protected, the reason the work mattered beyond personal history. When Mendez left, he paused at the door. "You know he'll keep trying to reach out." I sipped my coffee. "I know. And?" I gestured to the stack of case files on my desk, real veterans with real claims needing review. "I'll be here." The message was clear without being cruel. My father's chapter had closed. New stories awaited my attention, ones where truth still mattered and service still meant something. That night, I walked past the Vietnam Memorial one final time, my shadow stretching long across the engraved names. No dramatic speeches, no tearful goodbyes, just a quiet nod to those who'd actually earned their place on that wall. The pistol was gone. The records were set straight. And I, the daughter he'd never believed would amount to anything, had become the guardian of truths he could no longer outrun. Some might call it revenge. I called it justice. The difference mattered. The email from the Army Times arrived on the anniversary of my father's sentencing. The subject line read, "Interview request, women shaping modern military policy." I almost deleted it. Media attention still made my skin crawl, but the journalist's follow-up message caught my eye. "We're doing a feature on your fraud prevention protocols." Sergeant Major Mendez suggested we ask about their real-world impact. I agreed to the interview on one condition: no questions about my father. The reporter, a sharp-eyed veteran named Coulson, nodded when I laid out my terms. "Frankly, Captain, your reforms are the story. The personal drama is just background noise at this point." We met at a coffee shop near the Pentagon. Coulson's recorder captured the clink of cups and hum of conversation as I walked him through the protocols, how they'd identified over $2.3 million in fraudulent claims last quarter, how they protected benefits for real veterans. Halfway through, he paused, studying my face. "You know your system's being adopted by all federal agencies next month?" I didn't. The news landed quietly, another bureaucratic update in a sea of policy changes. Coulson smiled at my reaction. "Yeah, that tracks. Mendez said you wouldn't care about the credit." The article ran the following Sunday with my photo on page 3, not the White House ceremony shot I'd expected, but a candid of me reviewing files at my desk. The caption read, "Captain Sierra Kane's fraud detection model has become the gold standard for preserving veterans' benefits." No mention of family drama. No reference to stolen valor. Just facts. My phone remained stubbornly silent that day. No angry calls from my father. No pleading texts from my mother. Just a single email from an address I didn't recognize, a Vietnam vet in Ohio thanking me for protecting his brother's disability payments. I printed that email and added it to my office wall, right beside the framed DD 214. The juxtaposition spoke for itself. One document representing lies exposed, the other representing lives changed. No gloating necessary. At month's end, the VA hosted its annual awards ceremony. I sat in the audience clapping for clerks and caseworkers, never expecting my name to be called. When the Undersecretary announced the inaugural Guardians of Valor Medal, I walked to the podium on autopilot. The citation praised my unwavering commitment to preserving the integrity of veterans' benefits. The audience, hundreds of civil servants and military personnel, rose in applause. Scanning the crowd, I spotted Sergeant Major Mendez grinning like a proud father, a few rows back where my actual family should have been sitting. The moment should have tasted bittersweet. Instead, it simply was. The recognition I'd craved my entire life had finally come not from the people who'd withheld it, but from those who understood its true value. After the ceremony, a young corporal stopped me in the parking lot. "Ma'am," she said, snapping a crisp salute, "I just wanted to say, my squad leader in Afghanistan was a fraud like your dad. What you're doing matters." She handed me a challenge coin before disappearing into the night. I turned it over in my palm, the metal cool against my skin. On one side, the VA emblem. On the other, a single word: integrity. No grand reconciliation had occurred. No tearful apologies had been offered. But somewhere along the way, without fanfare or drama, I'd been seen, not as Grant Kane's disappointing daughter, but as Captain Sierra Kane, architect of systems that protected the honor of real service. That night, I placed the challenge coin on my bookshelf beside the thank you notes and awards. The collection had grown over the months, quiet testaments to work that mattered beyond family wounds. My phone buzzed as I prepared for bed. A news alert. Pentagon adopts Kane protocols for all military benefits. I silenced the device without reading further. The record stood. The work continued. And somewhere out there, a new generation of soldiers would never have to prove their worth the way I had. That was recognition enough. The moving boxes in my Arlington apartment stood half-packed when the call came. I balanced the phone between my shoulder and ear as I wrapped my framed certifications in bubble wrap, the plastic popping softly as the VA Undersecretary's voice filled the space between us. "The President wants you at the Pentagon," he said without preamble. "New position heading up the entire Benefits Integrity Division. They're doubling your staff and expanding your protocols military-wide." I paused, a bundle of packing tape suspended in my hand. The promotion would mean more than just a corner office and starched uniforms. It represented the final, irrevocable step into a future where my father's shadow couldn't reach. "When do I start?" "Next month. They're giving you the old Inspector General suite." A beat of silence. "Your father's lawyer called again yesterday, you know. Wants the probation restrictions lifted early." I resumed packing, sealing a box marked Office, Awards, with two precise strips of tape. "That's between him and the court." The undersecretary chuckled. "That's what I told him." By evening, the last of my personal effects were boxed: the military manuals, the challenge coins, the framed photo of my West Point graduation where I stood alone in my dress grays. Only one item remained on the wall: the redacted DD 214 beside the thank you notes from veterans. I left them hanging for now, a reminder of how far truth could travel when given proper ammunition. The new office at the Pentagon smelled of fresh paint and possibility. My nameplate gleamed on the door: Director Sierra Kane, Benefits Integrity Division. The space overlooked the courtyard where the flag flew at half-mast for some fallen hero I hadn't known. My predecessor's shadow boxes still lined the walls, tributes to a career I would now eclipse. Sergeant Major Mendez delivered my first briefing packet personally. "Got something you'll appreciate," he said, dropping a folder marked Case Review, high profile. Inside were the latest fraud prevention statistics, a 38% increase in detected claims since my protocols went live. The final page listed upcoming trainings at bases nationwide, my name featured as keynote speaker. "First one's at Camp Pendleton," Mendez noted. "Your brother's unit requested you specifically." I closed the file. Life had a way of circling back, though never quite to the same place. "Tell them I'll be there." The work consumed those first months: policy meetings with generals, testimony before Congress, late nights refining detection algorithms. My father became a distant specter, his probation updates arriving via automated court notices I filed without reading. The past held no power here, not when the future demanded so much attention. Spring arrived in a burst of cherry blossoms along the National Mall. I walked among them one Saturday morning, my uniform replaced by civilian clothes, my stride unburdened by old injuries or older resentments. Tourists flowed around me, oblivious to the woman who had reshaped military bureaucracy while settling ancient scores. Near the Vietnam Memorial, a group of school children clustered around a park ranger. "This wall holds the names of real heroes," the ranger explained as I passed. "People who gave everything for their country." I didn't stop. Didn't glance at the panel where I'd once left my father's pin. The gesture belonged to a different Sierra, one still fighting to prove her worth. The woman walking away had battles of her own choosing now, systems left to improve, soldiers still needing protection from those who would steal their honor. My phone buzzed as I reached the metro. The screen showed an unknown number, but the area code was familiar, my hometown. I let it ring through, watching the call vanish into voicemail where it could be dealt with later, if at all. The train arrived with a rush of warm air, its doors sliding open to reveal my reflection in the glass, a woman in her prime, her posture straight, her gaze steady. No longer anyone's disappointment. No longer fighting old wars. I stepped aboard without looking back. The system worked. And so did I. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives through quiet systems, forged by those who were overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. Captain Sierra Kane's journey was never just about exposing a lie, it was about defining a truth. A truth measured not in medals or myths, but in service, sacrifice, and the integrity to stand firm even when no one is watching. She did not seek revenge. She built reform. She did not chase recognition. She earned legacy. And in the end, the most powerful transformation wasn't her father's fall. It was her own rise into someone who no longer needed his approval, or anyone else's, to know her worth. The war was never hers to begin with. But the future? That's hers to command.